Dr. Rachael Pope, who's going to tell you about the Lyme Regis Hospitals.
That's very kind. It's lovely to see so many people here who are interested in hospitals, and it's lovely also to see all those that are ex-staff of the hospital. So the last one that I worked at, so that's really good. I'm going to talk about 5 sites in Lyme Regis that are described as hospitals. Another in Upline, the Red Cross Hospital, and a maternity home on Windsor Terrace. I will also briefly mention the Charmouth Village Hospital and its link to our hospitals here. There is a 6th site in Lyme Regis, which of course is the Medieval Hospital, which I did research and all the associated myths with that. But I had to remove it from the presentation because I thought you wanted to get your tea at a reasonable time. So, introduction about me. I trained as a physiotherapist and worked in Nottingham for several years. Moved to the old Princess Elizabeth Orthopaedic Hospital in Exeter, so I know all about the Exeter hits, before coming to Lyme in 1984. Became more interested in women's health and much later on went to specialised in that area of work. Left Lyme Hospital in 1992 when sadly, very sadly, it closed. I had a number of different roles in the local trust, completed an MSc at Manchester Business School and much later a PhD on the topic of cultural and organisational dysfunction in the NHS. So I am definitely interested in anything hospitals and anything health services, hence this talk. The booklet, the story of Lyme Regis Hospital, 1873 to 1973. Small plain booklet. I knew of this publication when I was working in the 80s, but sadly, I don't know why, I didn't buy one. As far as I know, there are only 3 or 4 copies in existence. And if anyone knows of any other copies, could you please let me know, because we'd be very interested in that, because we want to obviously look after them. I looked at this booklet more in 2018 when I was updating an article on the Lyme Regis Hospitals for the Lyme Regis Society. There was a problem with this booklet in that it had no authors on it and absolutely no references. Both Graham Davis at the research team at the library and I tried to find out the authors. The person who knew wouldn't tell us, which wasn't that helpful. Finally, Graham found information in a folder at the back of the museum, which had been put together mostly, I believe, by John Fowles. So that's where we got these names. Gwyneth Cheney and Joan Hinton. That's the reference that I put in the article, but actually now I think it should be the other way around, and we'll come back to that later. Strange. The search. I loved the research. Just finding out about all these different sites. I've learned so much. I've really enjoyed it. And it's been great fun, and I've met some really interesting people, and some of it has been really quite exciting. I did a lot of talking, a lot of questions, and a lot of listening. On the whole, not much is known about the hospitals, and there's not that much in the literature. And what I tried to do is get underneath that booklet, because people tend to keep referencing the same material. So it's trying to get around it and underneath it and find out where all this information is coming from. I went to the Dorset History Centre, and that was brilliant, because the minutes of the hospitals from 1873 onwards to 1948 are all there, plus other documents as well. I could have spent weeks in that place. So it's given me a lot more confidence in the validity of that document. However, if I'm going to do any more work on it, I would still want to check the data back with those minutes, because there are a few anomalies and discrepancies within the story booklet. I wrote a paragraph in Lyme Online, didn't get any responses to that at all, which surprised me, with giving information. I emailed U3A members and I got 3 very good responses, and U3A members, I have to say, have been very helpful to me. Did internet searching, of course, and then just looking at literature. Thanks to everyone. I call them my scouts and ferrets, the people that have been hunting around bits of information for me, or pieces to the jigsaw. But particularly thanks to Graham Davis at the museum, but also Peter Lacey, who does the articles in the Lyme Online and is described as one of our local historians. But he's been very good at pointing me to literature I didn't know about. So thank you, Peter. Right, the first site is the isolation hospital on the Cobb. Because I've been researching the medieval hospital and all the myths around that, I began to wonder whether the isolation hospital on the Cobb was a bit of a myth. Because there was no information in the Dorset History Centre. There was a couple of sentences, just notes in the museum folder. And when I was talking to people, they really didn't know anything about it. Even when you talk to people that seem to have contact with the Cobb, they still didn't know exactly where the old isolation hospital was, so-called. One person called it a smallpox hospital, another a cholera hospital. So I did a lot of chatting to various people. The aquarium website says part of the building. The story booklet talks about end of the Cobb, small room, hut, rusty bedstead and old mattress. I have no idea where the hut, rusty bedstead and old mattress came from, because I couldn't find it anywhere else, because I don't know. A bit more solid information was the Children in the Cemetery survey, Joan Walker, referencing a medical officer, talking about 2 rooms at the Cobb was still the only isolation available, and they had serious doubts about hospital accommodation. Quite rightly too, definitely serious doubts. There are other little snippets of stuff, different years, 1890, inspection of ships, 1893, Bridport News, cholera scare. They did put aside a boys' schoolroom in 1896, never used, they think, and 1901 it's down as being discussed at the Borough Council. So there was some awareness of it and knowledge of it. But this is when I hit more solid information. This is on the Historic Hospitals website. And there was actually a sanitary survey done because of the cholera scare. And that was 1893 to 95. It was done by local government and it was published in parliamentary paper. So this is more solid. And they list the hospitals and there's a report there, and there are some oddities. And lo and behold, guess what? We're an oddity. Bishop Auckland was a converted dog kennel. And while at Lyme, they set aside a room in a warehouse on the Cobb. And then there's a list of all the hospitals, and there you've got Lyme B, that means Borough Council, a room in a warehouse on the Cobb. So there we are. We're an oddity, folks. We're an oddity. So, Ebb and Flow, Peter's book. This is the only place that I found a date of when this isolation hospital started, and it's 1849. 1848-49 was the big cholera outbreak, and that's when thousands of people died. Peter says hardly ever used, but there were 2 seamen were admitted with suspected cholera 1866, but they didn't have cholera. Okay, so that was the only time it had been used. So, because I'd seen an article, I like to get a feel for places. So I contacted Steve Postles, and him and his assistant gave me a little tour of the top of the Cobb. Because I'd seen this article by Glenn Patrick, Lyme Online 2001. Part of the buildings, apparently once used as an isolation hospital, Lyme Regis Sailing Club occupied the same Cobb building, and there was still a clause in their lease. So I contacted Maurice Lydiard at the Sailing Club, and he told me about the book that they'd written, and that the first chapter was on the website. So there it tells you that they rented from the town clerk a room in the old isolation hospital on the Cobb, and they agreed to vacate in the event of plague, cholera, smallpox. And it was in force in the lease until 1996, when of course that would be when they moved over to the other place. So it was one room on the first floor, currently used by the fishing college. Now, so I found the sort of the what and where, but nothing really on the how. Because did they lock them up? Did they put a guard on them? I have no idea. The only thing we know from one of the notes was that Dr. Bangay, who was the first medical officer for Lyme, was paid 10 and 6 to check and the visits to the Cobb. So that's about the only thing that I was able to find about how it's supposed to work. But actually, it was only once. 1800s Lyme Regis, a pretty grim place really. High child mortality, gross poverty, overcrowding, infectious diseases spreading. Dorset, this surprised me, Dorset was one of the 6 most underfed counties. Don't know why it surprised me, but it did. Painter talking in ebb and flow, an underclass or sunken people, which is a very descriptive term. Abject poverty, the underclass, parish relief and charity. So pretty grim really. Richard Ball doing his talk on the listers at Highcliffe. Food riots, high bread prices, tap mill, years of mismanagement and neglect by the Henley estate. No hospital, poor food, poor hygiene, terrible sewage system, stinking, rubbish sewage going into the river from quite a few people, and poor people, no piped water supply. And of course there was the air pollution as well at this cement and tile works. So even if you had a lot of money in Lyme, it was probably a little unpleasant at times. Now, it's a century where there's a lot of, grim social conditions, but it was also a very dynamic century. And there were some very dynamic people who had a huge influence on what was happening in the health world. So we've got Elizabeth Fry, best known probably for her prison reform, but she also set up a nursing school. And when Florence Nightingale, they knew each other, so there was obviously some crossover influence there. When she went out to the Crimea, some of the Fry sisters went out with her. There was also a contact, and it's in Richard's Ball's article again, that Elizabeth Fry, the listers, they were Quakers, and there was contact between them at one of the Friends Meeting House. So these people, the listers, are important because Joseph Lister, Lord Lister of Lyme, pioneer of antiseptic surgery, influential family, and they really supported Lyme Regis Hospitals. So here we've got Florence Nightingale, founder of modern nursing. One of her famous quotes, the very first requirement in a hospital, that it should do the sick no harm. Sort of seems obvious, but it's probably more relevant today than it was then, because in a report last year, it was 11,000 deaths from avoidable harm, preventable, unavoidable harm in the NHS. It is a persistent and big, big problem. The BMJ article states that one lot, as well, more recently, was 1 in 20 patients suffer some harm. Okay, so we could learn a thing or two, I think, about focusing on her statement there that we should do no harm. So at this time, you've got increased training, increased requirement for nurses to get registration and be properly trained. And out of this time of trying to improve healthcare, she was very much focused on cleanliness, ventilation, space, and building hospitals and better conditions for the sick and injured. But out of that came the cottage hospitals. So there was an increased numbers late 1800s. Doesn't endorse it at that time, and three of those were us, Charmouth and Bridport. And of course there was a cottage hospital at Axminster, set up by a woman called Emily Conybeare in 1886. She paid for setting it up, and she paid the lease for the first year. So I think she did a good job as well. Right, Dorset History Centre. This is the first minute book. The title was Cottage Hospital of the District of Lyme Regis, up Lyme, Roosden and part of Axmouth. So that was the area covered at that time. So it was for the poor who were suffering from non-infectious disease, except enteric, which is intestinal, and for cases of accidents. Now, what they wanted to achieve at that time, in their document, they write that they wanted to give rest, quiet, careful, judicious and constant nursing. That sounds wonderful in our pressurised nursing wards at the moment now. Nourishing food in a cleanly, well-ventilated apartment. All of those things are problems in the health service. The lack of them have been and can be. So they looked at them as helps to recovery, which of course they are. So this is the entrance to our first hospital. Go down Sherborne Lane a little way. There's an arch on your left, a gate and an arch on your left. You go along that long path, and the middle cottage in there, Providence Place, was our first hospital. And the photograph on the right is taken from the back road, that one. So they had a public meeting to see whether the town wanted to support this project, and they did. Mrs. Lees offered Providence Place 10 guineas a year. So they had 4 beds, 2 up, 2 down, no inside toilet or water supply, but they did put in a water supply, a tank, but not a toilet. Nurse was appointed. There was the very important ladies' committee. 7 women at first, later 9. So their special duty was to visit. They took turns to be a monthly visitor and to supervise the internal management and also the district nursing. So internal management meant all the domestic arrangements, all the nursing arrangements, the employment of people as time went on, and they had more people other than the top person. They had to fundraise. They each had their own patch. They went door to door getting funds. They decided who paid what, depending on means of who came into the hospital. As time went on, I think it probably was quite a job, really, quite a responsibility that they were doing. An example of somebody on the committee, and I do say example because lots and lots, if you look at the minutes, there's lots and lots of names there. But Isabella Liston was one of those people that put a huge amount of work in. She was on the committee for 20 years. She was also involved with the World War I hospital. She nursed in London, and she was very, very involved and gave quite a lot of money as well. So that is just an example of the women that contributed through the Ladies' Committee to the day-to-day running. There was also a dispensary fund, and we've got Dr. Bangay again, First Medical Officer, gave his advice gratis to the sick poor of Lyme Regis. Charmouth Village Hospital. It was actually set up 6 years before the Lyme Hospital, so they were a bit ahead of the game there. But by 1887, they were in financial difficulties. And there's a gentleman, Rachael Pope, has donated a lot of documents and also photographs to the Dorset History Centre. And in there it said it was no record of when it was closed. 1887, Lyme made an offer to them to join and for them to come to the Lyme Hospital. And that's what they did. So we assume that's 1887 because something happened in the houses afterwards. It's that one. That's the Charm and Heron cottages there. Okay? So we then got a combination. So this is in a later document, but there's no date on that. But the name changed, Lyme Regis District Cottage Hospital, and you can see all the little villages around Charmouth were now coming to the Lyme site. So there's quite a bit of information about Charmouth Hospitals in the Dorset History Centre. Now, Providence was too small, and there was other problems, but they were offered Keble Cottage, but they didn't like it. They didn't like it at all. And they went looking for about another 5 sites, couldn't find what they wanted. In the end, they came back to Keble Cottage on Sidmouth Road. It was just above the junction between Pound Road and Pound Street. On the left, it was the site of the Pound, and was actually removed when the road was widened on Sidmouth Road. So that's that building. So there was 6 beds altogether, room for a space for a child's bed, and family Stangerleys, conflict over the date, I think it's 1890. The accommodation is insufficient, but they never liked it, and they were always looking for the next move. There is a discrepancy in dates, so Henry Chesel talks about 1886, and an author before that, 1927, Cyril Wankin, also uses that date. But in the story, they're talking about the legal lease document, which makes it 1889. They didn't know exactly the date, but my money is on 1889 because it was linking it to a legal document. Now, Joan Hinton and Joan Gwyneth, the story, wrote in their booklet about they were deep concerned about the level of bureaucracy in the health service that had taken over their hospitals. They didn't like it. But they also commented, even going back to the late 1800s here in this place, we were wondering where their focus was, because they were saying they spend all their time in discussing and revising the rules and regulations. I dread to think, and they don't get interested in the internal affairs, even in the 1800s. So, you know, bureaucracy's got a long history, obviously. But I dread to think what Joan Gwyneth would have thought of the bureaucracy in the health service now, because it's a bureaucratic monster. Right, so they had a 7 years lease at Keble Cottage, and in the 8th year they moved out. So, this is one of the myths. Everybody thinks that this place has been called the Gables forever. It's not true. Look at Graham Davis's article. It was previously called Nuremberg House. It was renamed the Gables after the hospital in 1927, when they then moved to go up to Pound Road. So the red wording there is what's on the notice board outside. Okay, so that's what they put there. So Joseph Lister, he chose of Lyme, though he didn't live here full time, was influential in what was happening in the cottage hospital, as well as other members of the family. Pioneer of antiseptic surgery. Here are the stamps, 1965, and that's when our gardens in Lyme were called Lister Gardens. Okay? When they were celebrating the work that he'd done, because when he brought in antiseptic surgery then, the death rate dropped dramatically. So he did amazing work. There's discrepancy on number of the beds in the literature, but I'll go with 8, 4 and 4, men and women. The operating theatre was financed by Lord Joseph Lister. His brother actually bought the house next door, apparently, and to help expand the place. So the family was definitely, that was Arthur, definitely involved. There's a nice little story in Lizzie Wiscombe's article, which is about her grandfather, Lionel Wiscombe, who had the builders opposite. He would go in to assist getting patients upstairs, because it was almost spiral staircase, and it worked best with one short man and one tall man. She didn't say which he was. I don't know, does anybody know? Whether it was either the tall man or the short man. But anyway, they had detachable banisters. I did try to get into this place, but it's all flats, and I didn't know of anybody in there, so I never managed to get in there and get a feel for the place. Rachael Red Cross Hospital closed in 1919, but lots of equipment, including X-ray machine, was donated at that time from the convalescent hospital. So here we've got Rose Hill. Alban Woodruff was the chair of the hospital committee for many, many years, and he owned this. And apparently he paid for the alterations to be done there. So it was 77 beds, there was an operating theatre, etc. So that information came from Electric Lyme. I recommend that book because it's not just about electrification of here. There's a lot of social history in that book. So, photographs. I hadn't quite trigged that these were convalescent hospitals. I'm not sure why. But the ordinary hospitals, big hospitals, and the military hospitals couldn't cope with what was happening. So here's some of the photographs. Some of these have been given by Helen Parker at the Charmouth History Society. Those with writing on them, and they're often mentioning Whittington sisters. There was three that acted as nurses at Rose Hill, and the other sister did a few hours at the court in Charmouth. So that writing actually tells you the court is a hospital, but that's not true. It's not on the list. And I went back to Helen, and she said it was the administrative and distribution centre. So it was Dorothy that worked there just a few hours a week there. Now, this is when I got really excited. Being a women's health physiotherapist, I didn't know there had been a maternity home in Lyme Regis. Whether anybody mentioned it to me, I have no idea. But I couldn't remember it. And Jackie, who lives in one of these houses, told me that people would say to us, she was out in her garden, that either it was a maternity home, or maybe they said, well, I was born in this house. Those houses built at the turn of the century, replacing dreadful sort of cottage hovels that were down there. And I found out there were twins born there at number 9. So I thought at first it was just number 9. I immediately went to Graham for some assistance and information. He came up with this. Harriet Agnes Coombs, midwife, lived at number 10. 1918 to 1932. In the census, 21, you've got Harriet as midwife and employer. You've got Muriel, the assistant, health visitor. Margaret, the patient, Isabel, and obviously little Herbert John Miller. So that was on the census, so that's really helpful. I then went away and did some more searching, and actually found out that she was listed under the King's Collection on the King's College London website as one of the pioneering nurses. So I thought that was fantastic. So that shows her date of registration and some of her training places she'd been, but also that she was employed in 1903 at the Church Street Hospital. Okay? And then the Dorset History Centre told me this. They looked at the trade directories. So there was Harriet again, 1931 this time. But there was also somebody else. There was H.M. Brooke, owned Lincoln Nursing Home, Windsor Terrace. But they didn't tell me what number it was, but it was suddenly another name. So what the connections are there, I'm really not quite sure. So all of this needs a bit more research. But I managed to get in because it was for sale. And Jackie next door, this is number 10, Jackie next door said it was on the market. So I rang up Kennedy's in Bridport and said, I don't want to buy your house. I said, but I do want to get in for historical purposes. And they were ever so good and got the owner, and the owner gave me the tour. So not much has changed in that house. It's been in that family for a long time, but not much had changed. And on the left, back. On the left here, that's the mark. You can't see with the box on the wall, but that is where the door between the two properties was. Okay? And you've got the old tiles. Don't know about the sinks, but there's an old fireplace, and I'm told by a friend that those were early 1900s. I don't know. I'm not expert in that area at all. So going back, right back. So that's the inside of that place. It's now being refurbished. So that gave me a feel for the place. But I was very delighted when I found a letter within the minutes book. And this was Dr. Philip Cook, who was a GP in Lyme, but also the third medical officer. And this was dated much later on the 11th of December 38. And he was asking for access to the theatres to be able to do operative procedures for maternity. And he was also asking for routine care as well. But 2 days later, he actually got what he wanted, which was access to the theatres, which was great. But he described the home as an old established maternity home. And he's saying there is now no maternity home in Lyme Regis. So he's concerned about the maternity care. But this jigsaw piece fitted together with the fact that I knew that an ex-nurse from the hospital had always said that she was the first baby born in Lyme Regis Hospital. I'm sure some of the people here that ex-nurses know what I'm talking about. But what I didn't know until recently was actually she was a cesarean. And she was born in 1939. So the hospital we're talking about is the last one, which was 1927 onwards. But no maternity cases were in that hospital until 1939. So obviously, most women had their babies at home. He thought that was the place that was best for women. And none were in the hospital at that time, but obviously that little maternity home was probably quite busy. Right, we're now switching back to the Church Street side, and there was problems there. They were working at trying to move yet again, because there was various problems. It was noisy. You had the church opposite with lots of bells ringing, more than they do now. You had the school next door with all the kiddies, you had the traffic outside, and you had the old gasworks, right? So it ponged a bit. So they were on the move. And this is when they were really going forward, and I think real vision really, because they had a dream hospital. They got an architect to design it, 12 beds, children ward, private rooms, and room for expansion. It was on this site here, okay? So this is where they wanted, finally, they wanted to put their next hospital. It had been secured and paid for, the site was in full. It was a lovely brochure they produced, and they put it out to the town to see whether they could get, the money to take this forward. But they must have wanted to weep, because this was just post-war. People were probably exhausted, no jobs, no money, I don't know, but they couldn't get much money at all. And so it all had to be shelved, which was deeply sad, because my thought was, just think if that had been there and it had been expanded, who knows what it, whether, things would have been very different for our hospital here. Who knows? So that was their dream hospital. Finally, they were rescued by Reverend Eyre. His mother lived in Hernley, and I've seen at least 5 different spellings of the word Hernley in all the literature, so I haven't a clue what the right one is. And he offered it first for a perpetual lease, it's described as, and then became later a gift, and as I say, a very generous gift. His mother died in Hernley in 1926, and in 1927 the hospital moved in. But they were very worried then that that hospital would be taken off them. So it is in the minutes, in capitals, it should never be used except as a hospital, and it should not become a state or municipal hospital. They were not, you know, they were wary back in 1920s what would happen to it. So that was Reverend Eyre. So these are the posters for the opening. The person who opened it was Sir William Lister, ophthalmic surgeon. So 10 beds, private rooms, theatre, and the accommodation on the ground floor, and that's where I lived for 6 months. So here we have the Pan Road site. So, there is my department, down in the bottom here. Casualty, clinic rooms, X-ray, going here, little bits and bobs along here, there's a little kitchen or there was. I can't remember what that was at the bottom there, never went in. This was the mortuary. This was the old theatres. I never went in that end, I expect it was storage. Somewhere in this section is the children's ward and the murals. And then you've got, coming along here, you've got the ladies' ward, and ladies' ward I think here, and then you've got the day room here. Okay, you'll never guess what that is, I'm fairly sure. That was the Wessex, supplied by Wessex, renal dialysis unit. And people used to come there and get their renal dialysis. For quite a few years that was there. Okay, and that's not my car, but that's where I used to park it. So here's another view of the hospital. Now, showing the community in action. This is the British Legion. Lots of people involved in clearing the site and building extensions, 1957 to 59, and some of the names that you can see there. The only, on the photo on the right, oops, the matron is holding the shovel. Right. Laying the first brick, there's Cecil Quick who led the team at that time. And then big 2-page spread is down in the museum, Cecil Quick's article, "We Built Our Own Hospital." Now you need to remember this was taken over by the NHS and the community was pouring in money, masses of money, supporting. And he's saying here, nobody would do it for us, that means the NHS. Okay? The NHS wouldn't pay for what they wanted to see here. So the whole town set to work. We raised money, laid the bricks, and soon we'll be saving lives. That's what they wrote. But there's a big article there. Nurses providing refreshments on the right there at the top. Women's Institutes got involved. So interesting on this picture, you've got Ida Quick. She was the, Ida Quick's in the middle there. She still lives in Upline. Yvonne Tolman's here, as I know her. Vid, she still lives in Lyme. And this gentleman here is Reverend Seal. And he's quite important in the story of the murals because I didn't realise until more recently that he actually did work on the murals to help maintain them and touch them up. So that was the person that did that. So you've got the Leave a Friend in action. Gwyneth Cheney is one of those. So they were building the physiotherapy department. That was the appeal plan, 1972, 1975. They were doing another extension. So people were very, very active in this town. Then we've got the rebirth of the Lyme Hospital booklet. So Gwyneth Cheney, this is funny wording, was she who got hold of the original documents from which the booklet was produced, now in the county archives. But it was written by Joan. So I think the reference has to go the other way around. Joan first. But they were a team. I'm sure they were a team. There was the services in the 1980s, and I'm sure I've forgotten some of those. Murals in the children's ward. I really wanted to find out what happened to the murals. I could remember them because every time I walked into this little men's ward there they were. I was not aware of who had done them. I never heard of Reverend Seal, I don't think, doing any work on them, not sure. But nobody talked about the background to it all. I think we just enjoyed them. They were just there. We always referred to that ward as the children's ward. I know I certainly did. And I was getting a bit down about this, that I hadn't been able to find out about the murals, because I asked lots of people and nobody seemed to know. So I then had the visit to the Lyme Regis Museum, end of October. And I was like a big kid. Honestly, I think the research team thought I was a bit balmy, really. But I got ever so excited because I found the newspaper articles, Dorset Echo, November 2001. And here were the murals. So they were there in 2001. And they were being covered over by David Rose, that you can see. There's David Rose here. He covered them over. We found out later he varnished them and put hardboard over them and then screwed that to the wall. If you look behind him, just there, you will see that they go down the other wall, because my memory was that they were all around the room. They weren't just on one wall. So the story was, on this article, Wyndham Payne, he was a youth leader. He'd taken 2 boys, because they were ill, to the children's ward at the hospital. They were looked after, he was happy, and so he offered to do these paintings. So that was the story. It was also the impression here was that this was done in 1937. That is incorrect, okay? Because I went back to the minutes, so that's wrong, but it's what the story tells you. So there are the murals. It was very exciting. So from there, it got more interesting. So that was on the Monday I went into the museum. Heather invited me for coffee on the front. So I took my photos with me because I knew she'd be interested, but I hadn't been able to do any searching on them at that time. So we sat and looked at the photos. And I just said to her, I said, I don't think those are stencils. I think they're free art. And then she said something that I hadn't thought of. She said, I think it looks like a book illustrator. I said, oh. Anyway, she got her phone out and got searching, you know. And we got more and more interested and more excited that we found all these references about Wyndham Payne on the internet. So I went home and I did some more searching and made contact with Paul, who's sitting over there, grandson of Wyndham Payne. Now, I was going to Paul because I wanted him to tell me more about these murals. I wanted more history, but he didn't know anything. He didn't know anything at all. No story in the family, nothing about the kids, nothing about the youth leader there, nothing. And he was able to tell me that a lot of Wyndham Payne's work was in the V&A. So more exciting. I was excited before I, knew who it was and just got more excited. So I rang up Betty Hodder and asked her would she come with me to visit the home, and because I thought 2 brains are better than one with trying to find the children's ward and the murals, because the home had been adapted, so you're never quite sure where things are. But by the time we got to the home, Rita Ellis, who we both knew and worked with, she had told the nursing staff that she'd remembered the room. So I don't think she remembered the murals, but she remembered the room. So by the time we got there, we could see the board. So I started a search for David Rose, and Moira and Jane in Collington tried to track him down, and they managed to. But also on Facebook, Penny Duffield put out a message on Facebook for me, because I'm not on there, and within 1 minute Ted Taylor had responded, and he just lives along the road from me, so I had a chat with him, and then Roy Cousins. So the builder. So that was absolutely brilliant because it was Roy who did work on the murals back in 1992. What Roy told me was that they had wanted the murals painted over. And he said words to the effect, I don't know whether he's here today, is he? Is Roy here? Roy is here, marvellous. You can correct me, Roy, if I'm wrong, what you're saying. But he said to me, he said, I told them, you can't do that. It's important, they're important. So he gave them free time, free work to put lining paper on the walls to protect those murals. So thanks ever so much, Roy. If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be looking at these photographs originally. So they've actually been protected twice now. So these are the minutes out of the History Centre. It was 1935 September they accepted the offer to paint the pictures. November 35 there was a vote of thanks. 36 in March there was the AGM, a delightful day of painted pictures done by Mr. Wyndham Payne's kindness and for which many thanks must be given. So that's when they happened. So they were done between September and November. The story also had the actual story of Wyndham and the boys in the camp, but they wrote, his amusing pictures are still there as bright as ever, helped by some touching up by Reverend Cyril. And they are as bright as ever, I think. They're lovely colours. So, Paul visited Lyme Regis for the first time, and it's not easy to see. Not easy to see, but you can see the frame that David Rhodes puts around that section. It's about 7 feet, I think, not sure. But that's where they were hidden. Sadly, we couldn't get to them that day. But the next day, Steve, the maintenance guy, had carefully taken off the boarding. And there's John as well. He's our expert photographer there. But John took that photograph the following day in the afternoon. We went up, brushed up there, because there was no patient in the room, so that was good. But lovely colours. On this one you can see there's a little bit of screw and nail damage at the bottom if you look hard. But magically, he got rid of those. So there's a really nice improved photograph there. So, but I've put it's a gift to the town because the story booklet said, described the Lyme Regis Hospital as a child of the town. So it was a gift to the hospital, but it was actually a gift to the town. So just to give you a flavour of Wyndham's work, he was the illustrator of the first UK edition of In the Willows. And this shows the book that William Connolly and Paul Payne published in 2020. But of course it didn't have anything about the murals in it, because Paul didn't know. So that was the book that was published in 2020. And then this was a fun afternoon, having lots of photographs and videoing of the murals. You can see Heather there, and Roy, and Paul, myself, and Rita Ellis, who helped us. And she was interviewed, and Roy was interviewed by Eleanor, who's sitting down here, videoing and photographing. And yeah, it was great fun. And we even had another resident, Poppy and Celia, who came to inspect us and do a tour around the room several times. So that was our fun afternoon. So, and then Betty Hodder came up with this lovely photograph, and I know Christine Matthews here has got another copy of this one, which is lovely. We've got, from the left, Jennifer Dixon, which we haven't been able to contact, Angela Tucker, Percy Goldsworthy, patient in the bed. Notice the sign above his head, matron's office, Christine Matthews and Betty Hodder. So Angela tells me that it has to be before September 1990 because she went away and did a training. But we don't know precisely when this was taken. But interestingly, Angela said to me just this week, reminded from the photograph that this is when we used to have time to care. And you have to ask the question, if you haven't got time to care, what are we doing as a health service? But anyway, there are the murals. And, oh, there, that's the little pig and the rats and the duck section. So that wasn't protected. Those were in the article there. Okay, so some lovely animal pictures along there. But that's a really nice photo, really sort of happy photo. It's lovely. So, sad loss of our hospital. I didn't realise that there's been 4 private companies in there already. There might even be more that I didn't manage to track down. Now, this is my physio department. I'm utterly ashamed of it. Look at it. It's got vegetation climbing out of the top, and disgusting. The inside's not so bad, but it's disgusting. But this is what it used to look like. Anybody like to tell me who that gentleman is? You perhaps don't recognise him standing up. Peter Williams, definitely. That's Pete Williams. So that's a walker that he could shift around the department. And he is one of the twins that was born at Windsor Terrace, of course, with Stan. So you know those two. So Pete was deputy head at the primary school for a long time, and then councillor, as was Stan. So we used to have time to care. So let's come back to the things that we can learn from the people in the 1800s. What we should be trying to achieve and not to do any harm. And when I was researching the medieval hospital rules, I found this. Sick and weak people should be admitted kindly and mercifully. That's a good start as well. I don't think frail, vulnerable people queuing up in ambulances and queuing up in A&E is kind or merciful. It's also about not doing staff harm, because only yesterday there was a report that came out, the harm that's being done to staff that can't deliver the services that they want to deliver in emergency services, and they're so, mentally so stressful because of people dying. Right, so dynamic people and communities, vision, generosity, commitment. Lyme Regis Hospital was a child of the town. And we can feel proud of our predecessors. Thank you to all those that have contributed and assisted. That it? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rachael. That was fantastic. And I've got to say, the illustrations in the hospital, it was a privilege to go and see them. They're absolutely wonderful. And there will be an article in the summer all over the town featuring some of those pictures. So, are there any questions?